You are now listening to theGrio's Black Podcast Network, Black Culture Amplified.
You know, back in slavery days, white people were so mean, but you got to understand it was a different time. And during Jim Crow, I don't understand why, more white people didn't fight for equal rights, but you got to understand, that was a different era. And when you meet some white people, they are really racist, especially the old ones, but you got to understand, they're from a different time. But what I don't understand is, when was that time when you could just be racist? That's why I want to welcome you to theGrio Daily, the only podcast that will explain why a different time is now. Yeah, man, I know you've heard that thing before, right? Like, people always talk about, like, the founders, they weren't racist. They were just from a different time. Or that's how it was back then. Or you know how old people are. Or you know how it was back then. That is a common thing used to explain away racism or prejudice or any kind of bigotry, right? Like, those bigots, they're from a different era. But what most people, especially the white people, don't understand is, we're in the same era. It's not like humans grew a second head or the size of our brain increased or black people became more human between 1865 and now. No, we are the same people. We're all the same people. Public attitudes haven't changed much. It's just that white people didn't care what black people thought. It's not that they didn't hear. It's not that black people didn't object. It's not that we didn't say, hey, you can't say that or you can't do that. It's just that they didn't care. Let's give you some examples. Take the founders in slavery. More than half of the men who signed the Constitution owned slaves. It is reasonable to believe that they were just a product of their time, except that half of the signers of the Constitution didn't own slaves. They were just as powerful. They were just as important to the founding of this country. They were just not as racist as the other half. There were people like John Adams who refused to own slaves. He didn't buy slaves, right? There are reports that he had a black worker in his house, although it's not quite clear that the person was a slave or not. The abolition movement is older than America, right? The movement to end slavery began before America became a country. So when America was founded, there were people saying, hey, you need to stop that slavery shit. But America didn't care. It was not that they were a product of their time. It's that they were a product of whiteness. Oh, here's another example, right? Let's take the time after slavery. Let's talk about Jim Crow, right? People who didn't want black people in their neighborhood or going to their schools or in their churches, stuff like that. When they say, oh, that's how it was back then, it really wasn't like that back then, right? First of all, you got to think about this. Like, slaves couldn't just wander around and go wherever they wanted to. They couldn't leave the plantation or their master's house. Well, why not? Because they were enslaved people. And because they were enslaved people, that means all of those racist slave owners back then lived right around slaves. They had slaves in their neighborhood. Like, if you lived on a plantation and you owned slaves, that means slaves are in your neighborhood. All those people in the South lived in neighborhoods with enslaved people. They attended church with enslaved people, right? Like, some of the first black congregations in America began in white congregations. They attended church with white people. They attended schools with white people in the North. So when Jim Crow arose, white people had to make a certain choice. They chose to not be products of the time that they were living right alongside black people and create a whole new different time. They were not products of their time. They were products of a time that they created. Same thing is true with, for instance, with the people who, call black people colored or Negroes or, the N-word. It's not like there was ever a time when black people liked to be called the N-word, right? Not by white people. There was never a time when black people didn't have a specific name that they wanted you to call them, right? So when black people wanted to be colored, white people still call them the N-word. When black people wanted to be Negroes, white people still call them the N-word. When black people wanted to be black, white people still called them the N-word. When black people wanted to be called African American, white people called them the N-word. And here's the thing about it, right? When black people went from Negro and colored to black, and then from black to African American, how come all the black people knew and none of the white people? How come when we went from colored to black, we got the memo, but white people didn't? Did we have a separate telegram system? Did we send out a chain letter? Did we have a separate radio or TV station that say, hey, we black now, not Negroes? No, white people knew. They chose not to be products of their time. They wanted to be products of the past. And even the same is true with stuff that doesn't have to do with race. There was a time when most of this country was not in favor of abortion. There was a time when most of this country opposed gay marriage. It's not that gay people's position changed, because there were gay people who were loved and wanted to be married 100 years ago. It's not that the women who needed an abortion 100 years ago changed their mind. It was just that people who opposed abortion back then and are in favor of it now saw the need for women to have reproductive rights. And those who opposed it are not products of a time when no one knew what abortion was. They are products of white supremacy. They are products of a time that they created in their head. And so no one is really a product of it. Okay, well, there's one example, right? Like the people who don't subscribe to theGrio Daily, they're products of their time. The people who don't download the theGrio app, yeah, you late because you're a product of your time, right? I understand why some people don't tell their friends about it, because their friends, you know how it was back then, but that's why you got to do it. And that's why we always leave you with a saying from Black America. Today's saying is, you know how it was back then, racist. We'll see you next time on theGrio Daily. If you like what you heard, please give us a 5-star review, download the theGrio app, subscribe to the show, and share it with everyone you know. Please email all questions, suggestions, and compliments to podcast@thegrio.com.
You are now listening to theGrio's Black Podcast Network, Black Culture Amplified.
The 80s gave us unforgettable songs from Bob Marley, De La Soul, and Public Enemy.
I'm a black man, and I can never be a veteran.
Being Black the 80s is a podcast docuseries hosted by me, Torre, looking at the most important issues of the 80s through the songs of the decade.
Can I have another hit? The dope man said, "Cluck, I don't give a."
A decade when crack kingpins controlled the streets, but lost their humanity.
You couldn't be like no soft, smiling, happy-go-lucky drug dealer. You had to suppress that.
It was a time when disco was part of gay liberation.
It provided the information to counter narratives that were given to gay people by the straight world.
This is the funkiest history class you'll ever take. Join me, Torre, for Being Black the 80s on the theGrio Black Podcast Network or wherever you listen to podcasts.